Help Jews in Poverty at helpjewsnow.org. Your $25 gift today will help provide a life-saving food box to Jews in need. Be a blessing right now. Visit helpjewsnow.org. That's helpjewsnow.org.
This is a CBC podcast.
Ontario reported 600 new COVID cases yesterday. The province is now in the fourth wave of the pandemic, and as cases continue to rise and children are back in class, concerns mount. Many have questions about the potential severity of this wave, given Ontario's high vaccination rates. For his thoughts, we spoke with Dr. Isaac Bogoch. He's an infectious diseases physician and scientist at Toronto General Hospital.
Hey, good morning.
So, Dr. Bogoch, help us understand where Ontario is at right now. Last week, the province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Kieran Moore, stressed that vaccines dramatically reduce the threat of hospitalization and death. But he also said COVID-19 was here to stay and to expect an uptick in cases. So why are there concerns about the fourth wave if so many of us have been vaccinated?
Yeah, I mean, every one of those points that Dr. Moore made is correct, but of course it still might leave a few people confused because how could we have a risk of a fourth wave if almost 85% of eligible people in Ontario have received at least the first dose of a vaccine, or getting close to 75% of the total population has received a first dose of a vaccine. There seems to be a bit of a paradox there, but the answer is really when you look at the absolute numbers of people. So it is fantastic that so many people have come out to get vaccinated. And in fact, that's helping a lot, like a lot. Having said that, when you look at the absolute number of unvaccinated people in Ontario, it's measured in the millions. When we look at who's unvaccinated, that's people who are unvaccinated, some because of choice, some because of barriers, some because of ineligibility due to age. Like, there's a lot of reasons for people to remain unvaccinated. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you look at who is unvaccinated that are over the age of 50, that's about 750,000 people, about 750,000 people. That's a lot of people. And those are the individuals who, if they get COVID-19, are much, much, much more likely to land in hospital. So, I mean, I know it's a bit long-winded, but it's important. When you have a very transmissible Delta variant, when you have 750,000 people over the age of 50 who remain susceptible to the virus, and when you now have, for lack of a better word, innumerable opportunities for the virus to be transmitted as we move through September and people start to move indoors for school, for work, for recreation because it's getting colder outside, you can't get surprised if you see a rise in cases predominantly, but not exclusively, among the unvaccinated. And then the cherry on top is we don't have the most robust healthcare system in Ontario and elsewhere in Canada. When you look at our ICU capacity, it's not really that good when we look at Canada versus other comparable countries. I mean, so we do have limited capacity here. So, yeah, I mean, many of us in the healthcare sector are walking on eggshells as we walk into the fall with the concern that cases could go up, and we just don't have the capacity to manage a large surge in cases if there was one.
Yeah, so you're saying the number of unvaccinated people, it adds up and it makes a difference in the transmission of Delta in particular.
It does, and it just creates a greater burden on the healthcare system. I mean, the reason to lock down would be if the healthcare system was overwhelmed. That's basically why we locked down before. Don't overwhelm the healthcare system. Look what's happening in Alberta right now. I mean, they have virtually no ICU capacity in the province. We've got to avoid that at all costs, because if you start to overwhelm the healthcare system, you have poor health outcomes for not just everyone with COVID-19, but for everybody in the province. It has a tremendous negative ripple effect. And, when you have people who are at risk of, like a real risk of landing in hospital if they got COVID-19, plus limited healthcare capacity, plus a very transmissible Delta variant, plus a free, widely available, safe, and effective mechanism to prevent that from happening. I mean, you don't shrug your shoulders. You really want to encourage everyone to get that vaccine.
We have heard more about breakthrough infections in recent weeks. Who is most at risk of these infections, breakthrough infections, and most at risk of severe health outcomes?
Well, I mean, for starters, I don't think we should think of breakthrough infections as being all that uncommon. We know from the original clinical trials, even before the Delta variant emerged, that breakthrough infections were par for the course. You look at the first trials of COVID-19, lots of people got COVID who were vaccinated. But as you hit the nail on the head, the key thing here is these vaccines really, they do reduce your risk of getting COVID, but the heavy lifting is where they reduce your risk of having a severe infection, hospitalization, and death. Those who have a breakthrough infection who have a poor outcome, the emerging data from the UK, from the US, from everywhere in the world really demonstrates no big surprises. It's people on the older end of the spectrum, especially those over 80, and people with underlying medical conditions, especially those with immunocompromising conditions. Having said that, even when we look at those populations, the vaccine still significantly reduced the risk of hospitalization and death, but we do see a signal amongst the noise that there is a greater risk of hospitalization and death in those vaccinated groups versus other vaccinated groups.
As we continue to deal with and manage the pandemic, is it likely that Ontarians will need a third dose?
I think, well, for starters, some Ontarians are getting a third dose right now.
Yep.
People who reside in long-term care facilities are getting a third dose, and some people with select immunocompromising conditions are getting a third dose now. That's happening. Like, as we speak, those programs are rolling out. I think we all have to be open-minded that a third dose for everybody may be on the table at some point in the future. But right now, it does not appear that that would be necessary. The vaccines are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They're keeping people out of hospital. They're keeping people from dying. They're preventing people from getting the infection. Like, they're doing everything as advertised, even with the Delta variant. But you know what? Like, we don't have a very good crystal ball, and I think it's fair to say that, yeah, maybe in the future, I don't know when, but maybe in the future we will need a third dose.
I want to get in one more question really quickly here. Is there data on whether some vaccines are more effective against the Delta variant than others?
I wouldn't say just for the Delta variant. I would say probably in general. There's a shred of evidence demonstrating that Moderna might provide more long-lasting immunity versus the other ones. But to date, all of the vaccines seem to be holding up against the metrics that matter. And that is, does it keep you alive? Does it keep you out of the ICU? Does it keep you out of the hospital? And the answer seems to be yes, and all of them appear to be doing it. But I think if we were to fast forward a year from now and look back, we might see that Moderna may have more long-lasting effects. It just seems to be more immunogenic, meaning it triggers a more robust immune response compared to the others. Dr.
Bogosh, very good speaking to you. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Dr. Isaac Bogosh is an infectious diseases physician and scientist at Toronto General Hospital. According to recent modeling from Canada's Public Health Agency, hospital capacity is again approaching its upper limits across the country. For more than a year and a half, the pressure has been unrelenting on doctors, nurses, and support staff. Dr. Anne Collins is the past president of the Canadian Medical Association. She's here to talk about the effect this is having on our healthcare workers. Dr. Collins, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
At this point in the pandemic, what are you hearing from healthcare workers about the psychological impact of the job?
Well, our healthcare workers are tired, in many instances burnt out, and now, of course, they are frustrated by not only having to confront what they do inside their workplace, but in, unfortunately, many parts of the country, confronting challenging times getting in and out of their workplace, which, of course, makes absolutely no sense and is really totally inappropriate.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about the protests against COVID measures that we've seen at some hospitals across the province, across the country. What are you hearing from healthcare workers about what the weight of that is on them?
Well, again, it's very frustrating for them. In some instances, unfortunately, it's been very scary for them. And we have to remind ourselves, too, that this is all within the context of a fourth wave of this pandemic. So they're, again, seeing the ravages that this disease can impose. And what's very frustrating for them is not only dealing with those who are misinformed, but also knowing that what they're seeing inside their workplace is entirely preventable. That those that they're now treating with COVID, for the most part, are unvaccinated. So that speaks to our need to continue doing whatever we can to promote vaccination, and to seeing strong leadership from our elected officials to use whatever measures can be to increase vaccination rates.
Mm-hmm. I was speaking with a healthcare worker who was saying that they were feeling, they were having, more fractious interactions with patients, that it had just got to this more of a boiling point in the pandemic. How is what healthcare workers are experiencing now, and the time which they have been experiencing this unrelenting pace of the pandemic, how does this compare to last year at this time?
Well, this is all cumulative, right? And there have been so many iterations, and this pandemic has evolved in so many ways. But I think what's an important point to make here is that they're dealing with all this inside a healthcare system that is broken. It was broken prior to the pandemic. It was broken in the first, second, and third wave, and it continues to be broken. And so this is a time, and particularly in the face of this federal election campaign, when healthcare workers and Canadians, over 60% of Canadians, we know from our recent poll, are saying healthcare needs to be a priority, and we need to implement. Our leadership needs to have the courage to implement not improvements, but fixes to our system. And so that all it will support our healthcare workforce.
And when you say that the healthcare system is broken, what are some of those break points, and what are those fixes you want to see?
Yeah, well, absolutely. The breaking points are really we've talked about and know about. The resources to care for COVID patients is one aspect of it, but of course the backlog is another issue, and these healthcare workers that are working now will be expected to deal with that as well. However, we know 9 out of 10 Canadians know that we need increased funding. Our system has been chronically underfunded. We've had inadequate workforce planning. We have lack of data to tell us what we're going to need in the future, and we need better management and deployment of our healthcare workforce. Look, we've got all kinds of studies and commissions sitting on shelves that have told us over the years what needs to be done. Our leaders need to brush the dust off, and let's get some of this work going.
What do you see as the long-term consequences of burnout that medical professionals that you're alluding to there, that they are experiencing now? What are the long-term consequences of that?
I think instead of talking about long-term consequences, we need to talk about what we're dealing with now. We are already seeing, for example, nursing staff either leave the profession, take themselves out of acute care bedside nursing jobs, go to part-time jobs. We, have heard of physicians who perhaps were looking at working another 5 years, taking early retirement. So that's in front of our faces right now, and that's why it's so critically important that healthcare workforce planning be dealt with now. We need to do whatever can be done to improve and to the workplace situations for those people we have in the system now.
And if those changes aren't made, what is the consequence of that?
I think that can be summed up in simply that if we do not have a healthcare workforce, we don't have healthcare.
Dr. Collins, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Ann Collins is the past president of the Canadian Medical Association. Silent vigils took place at hospitals across the country yesterday to protest what they consider government overreach in the COVID-19 crisis. In response, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau talked about bringing in new legislation to address protests outside hospitals.
There are specific protections in the criminal code against intimidation of journalists. Specific protections in the criminal code against intimidation or threats against folks working in the justice system. We are going to add specific threats against healthcare practitioners as requiring those protections. And it's unfortunate that we got there, but we think that these people deserve our highest level of protection because they have done so much for all of us over these past 18 months.
That is Liberal leader Justin Trudeau at a campaign stop. The hospital demonstrations yesterday were organized by a group called Canadian Frontline Nurses and took place in several Ontario cities, including Barrie. Janice Scott is the president and CEO of the Royal Victoria Health Centre in Barrie. Good morning to you. Welcome back to the program.
Good morning, Julianne.
What did you see outside of RVH yesterday?
At the peak of the protest, approximately 40 people gathered on this street just outside of the hospital where they were protesting unmasked, protesting against the safety measures that are in place to protect our community.
And to your knowledge, did the protests include any of your staff?
I do not have that information at this time.
Seeing the protests out there, what are you hearing from your staff about how they feel seeing the group of protesters out there?
I think on one hand, we're all proud to live in a country where people can peacefully express their opinions. But these rallies in front of hospitals are, frankly, they're disheartening, frustrating, and quite frankly, offensive to healthcare workers. Frontline workers have worked just tirelessly throughout this 18-month grueling pandemic, and they know firsthand the tragedy and the heartbreak of the impact of the pandemic, so it was not appropriate.
What kind of impact does this have on patients?
Well, first of all, no patients were prevented from either entering or exiting the site, but it's just very intimidating to be having to drive through a crowd of people who are unmasked. And, of course, we're doing everything possible at RVH to ensure there's a very safe environment for our patients, for our staff, and, of course, their families ultimately. So it is uncomfortable for people to have to drive through a crowd of people who are protesting. And, we are a regional cancer, cardiac, and renal center in addition to a number of other areas. And so many of our patients are very immunocompromised. They're very sick. And it isn't appropriate that patients would feel any additional stress having to come on the campus.
Some healthcare workers are calling for safety zones around hospitals. They have a petition going with more than 5,000 signatures so far. Has that option come up at all in discussion at your hospital?
We've certainly let our staff know that we do not support the protests, and also, of course, there's nothing we can do to stop them because the protesters weren't actually on our property. So any legislation that could be introduced to prevent this from happening in the future is something we would support.
Okay, and we did hear that clip off the top, Justin Trudeau talking about legislation. Any thoughts in particular, what you would like to see in something like that?
It's important that people find their voice and express their peaceful opinions in other venues. So it's very important that we protect the environment upon which healthcare workers come to work and to practice, as well as, of course, patients who are going to receive care.
I think you're really getting to the point of this, the core of this, which is that balance. And how do we do that? How do we balance the rights of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly with public health?
It's very important that those who wish to protest just find a different backdrop, one that maybe will have more of a voice, for example, towards government in there. And again, peaceful expression of dissatisfaction or disagreement is part of our country makeup, but it should not be in front of a hospital.
If you could sit across one of the people who was outside your hospital yesterday, what would you say to them?
I would say that the evidence is clear that the COVID cases are yet again on the rise. They're fueled by a highly transmissible Delta virus and variant, and we do know that hospitalizations and deaths are much higher among unvaccinated people. So I'd want them to try and be safe, to take care of themselves, and of course to take care of their families.
Janice Scott, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Janice Scott is the president and CEO of the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre in Barrie. For more on this, we'll turn to a perspective from nursing. Doris Grinspun is the CEO of the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario. Doris, welcome back to the program.
Good morning, and thank you for having me back, Julian.
What is your reaction to yesterday's protests?
Well, I am less patient than Julia. I am absolutely outraged, and so are 99% of the nurses with whom I have spoken. Yesterday I met with a group of over 100. They had it with this. I would ask one thing, Julian, from you, is not to name the group, because only gives them more force, which is what they want. We are calling them the no-name group. It's a disgrace to our profession, and no, not all the people in those rallies are nurses. In fact, a tiny minority, the organizers only. These are people that are upset about what has happened before with masks. They also did the rallies when we had the lockdowns. They did them against the law. We report them to the college. The college is investigating. Julian, they will find any excuse, because some of these people in these groups are extremists that have nothing to do with COVID, have to do with the MAGA movement. They already said that they are linked to the PPC. So we need to be very careful. This will not stop here, and hence why they must get out of healthcare facilities. They must get out of schools. I don't know if you heard that in Montreal was one in schools. Just imagine kids seeing this type of rallies. And no, they may say that they're quiet, the rallies, but anybody that watched the news knows it's not quiet. And as my colleague just said, patients are terrified and very stressed, and they don't need this stress, nor do the healthcare workers.
And Doris, you were saying that 99% of your membership is against these protests, but I'm wondering about the different views within your membership and how you balance advocating for concerns your members have on both sides of the issue.
We believe fully in democracy. Do it at Queen's Park, do it in City Hall, do it in Parliament, do it, where policymakers make the decisions, and then let's have good discussions about why those decisions were made also. And everybody else knows that Delta virus is really a virus that is after mainly the unvaccinated. Those are the people that end up in hospital beds. Those are the people that are pushing aside people with cancer, with heart conditions and other conditions that have been waiting for treatment. And yet again, in many places, the treatment is being delayed. We don't want to get to a situation like Alberta. You heard what's happening in Alberta. We are not far away if we continue this situation. People need to understand, first of all, democracy, not in the hospitals outside to rallies that really add stress to patients and add stress and absolutely disgust to the staff that are trying to get to do the work that they need to do for patients. And second, let's have good discussions about why we are asking mandatory vaccination. Actually, it's RNO that started asking for mandatory vaccination. So you want to have good conversations? Let's have them with me. I have no problem for the people to have those conversations, and we will talk about why the vaccine is so effective and why it's important for healthcare workers.
Doris, I'm just going to cut in. I just wanted to cut in and bring up this point, which is it is a right to protest in this country, and some worry that there may be a slippery slope if we start restricting where protests can happen, no matter how much we disagree with them. What would you say to those concerns?
I would stand absolutely side by side with leader Justin Trudeau that healthcare workers and healthcare facilities where patients need to have their care. It's not the place where you do this type of protest against the facilities and against the workers. This is about, basically, they're saying this time is about the mandatory vaccination for healthcare workers. Well, you know what? That needs to go to Queen's Park. That doesn't need to go to every single hospital or any hospital in this country. This is a sacred place to provide the care that people necessitate, and any nurse that is organizing a protest.
I've got to leave it there. I want to thank you very much for your time this morning.
You're very welcome.
Doris Grinspun is CEO of the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario. Before that, we spoke with Janice Scott. She is president and CEO of the Royal Victoria Health Centre in Barrie. A shortage of veterinarians in Ontario is leading to long waits, more complaints, and emergency clinics pulling out of the practice. The industry has not been producing enough vets to meet demand for years, and now many of them have been pushed to a breaking point by the pandemic puppy craze. The CBC's Jackie Sharkey has been looking into this story. Jackie, good morning.
Good morning, Julianne.
How bad is the vet shortage?
So this has been happening for a while now, but for many pet owners, it's not something they notice until it directly affects them. So this spring and summer, I started to see a trend in some of the dog groups that I'm part of. People were reporting long waits when they were taking their pets in for emergency procedures. And as it turns out, what was already a serious problem pre-pandemic has only been amplified by the pandemic puppy craze. Jen Robinson is Chief Executive Officer for the College of Veterinarians of Ontario. They're the body that actually licenses vets and also accredits their clinics.
We've got an increasing access issue that now is at a place where many areas of the province, veterinarians are not able to take on new clients. They're not able to see emergency cases of individuals that weren't their client, or that they are just at capacity and can't even bring their regular clients in.
She told me they've actually seen a significant increase in the number of complaints against vets and their clinics. So from one year to the next, the complaints tend to rise by about 15%. But over the past year of this pandemic, complaints to the regulatory body, they increased 40%, which is really significant for them. Now, not all these complaints are valid. They've not all been evaluated by the college. They're not all actionable, but it's still significant. The other thing that's happening is that emergency vet clinics, these are the places that operate like 24/7, like the ER at a hospital is, they're asking to change their accreditation status. So what that means is that Robinson is seeing a trend where those emerge clinics are asking to either stop being an emerge clinic altogether or switch to the bare minimum, so just overnight and weekend hours. Before the pandemic, there were about 30 of these clinics across the province. Over the summer, about 20% asked for a change. And that has a ripple effect. Other vet clinics set their hours knowing who they can refer out to when there's a pet in distress. As those disappear, that will continue to squeeze supply of vet hours, and that's in addition to a pre-existing shortage of vets in Ontario and really right across the country.
So many kids say they want to be veterinarians when they grow up. So why is there such a shortage?
It is a dream job for so many kids, but it really isn't easy in reality, like a lot of those dream jobs, really. Ian Sandler has been working as a veterinarian for 27 years. He's got a practice in Toronto, and he says that deep emotional connection is often what makes veterinarian work so draining.
For many, especially younger veterinarians, to go into a new puppy exam is really exciting. It's exhilarating. You're getting to meet, an amazing new dog or cat. And unfortunately, several years later, you're in a situation where, your next appointment is a euthanasia appointment. And so to have to go from this kind of high and low is very, very difficult.
Rates of suicide in the profession, they're higher than in others. Sandler says it's not uncommon for new vets to leave the profession after just 5 to 7 years of work. The next crop of veterinarians, they prioritize work-life balance, so they resist working those evenings and weekends. Add to that the pandemic. And while there were worries at the beginning of this pandemic that puppy mania would end up with shelters overflowing with unwanted pets as people move back into the workplace, we've not really seen that happening.
What is the impact?
Well, it means that new owners are having trouble finding vets. It means that people are traveling to neighboring cities for emergency care. It means that people are waiting for hours in parking lots in the cold, in the winter, in the heat, in the summer before that their pet can even be seen by a clinic. And here's where it gets really sad, Julianne. I spoke with 2 people who needed urgent help, but were actually turned away. In Bailey Gladwin's case, she had had her dog Odie for about a year and a half, but then one Wednesday morning, he woke up with what was just a cough to begin with, but by that evening, Odie could barely catch his breath, and they couldn't get into the emergency clinic until midnight. He was not doing well, so the overnight vet wanted to transfer Odie to the Ontario Veterinary College in Guelph, or at least another clinic with a ventilator.
She called OVC. She called a couple of other specialists in the area that had ventilators or had the capacity to deal with a respiratory case. And he wasn't granted admission to any of those veterinary clinics.
When they did finally find one in Scarborough, Odie's condition had worsened. The clinic had said, but at that point, transporting Odie could kill him. So they gave him more antibiotics. They gave him a bit of time, but he didn't respond. And a day and a half after that first little cough, Gladwin was saying goodbye to her dog.
Around 8 o'clock, we got the call that he wasn't going to make it.
Did you get a chance to say goodbye?
I did. He went septic, and he had brain damage.
That is incredibly tough. The Ontario Veterinary College refused to admit Odie. Why?
So this is one of those cases where we're just not going to know the specifics about why. Jeffrey Witchell is the dean of the Ontario Veterinary College, and he said that because Odie was not actually admitted, he was never actually a patient of theirs. So even if his owner said, yes, you could see the files, there aren't any. But what Witchell does say is that Odie's story, it's tragic, and it is all too common right now.
What this owner experienced is what many owners across Ontario and Canada are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. It's not how it should be, but it's a reality. Veterinary emergency and urgent care hospitals are not just part of this workforce shortage. They are the pointy end of the problem.
So while it's hard to really quantify the magnitude of this problem, every single person who works in this industry agreed this is happening. Complaints are up. Emergency vet clinics are closing due to burnout. And owners are saying their animals are getting delayed care and sometimes dying because of it. It's a real problem.
So what can be done about it?
So the solution is more vets, but the question is where to find them. There's only 5 vet schools across the country. Ontario's single vet schools in Guelph. And while they're really the gatekeepers of the profession, increasing class sizes is more complicated than it sounds, and it's not really going to fix the problem right away. Those students won't graduate for another 4 years if we up the numbers today, so that's not immediate. But on top of that, the Ontario Veterinary College, as part of the University of Guelph, is actually at the top of its enrollment band. And if you go above total enrollment, the province won't give the university any more money to fund those grads. And veterinary school is one of the most expensive programs to run, more than even medicine. Here's Dean Witchell again.
The reason we're stuck at 120 is because that's the most we can train given our resources that we have now. And we would need both capital and also operating, support to grow our class.
So a school it's talking to the provincial government about trying to make that happen, but there are no commitments at this point. Another option is licensing more internationally trained vets, making the harder parts of the profession, working evenings and weekends, making that more appealing through better compensation. The problem is all these strategies take time to take effect. So in the meantime, people can expect to see more telemedicine, which allows people to communicate remotely with a vet through phone or video chat. As well as vets specialize and the industry looks to make the profession and its pressures more appealing to, millennials and the next generation, that is going to take more money. So the cost of vet care will also likely go up.
Jackie, thank you very much for this.
You're welcome.
That's the CBC's Jackie Sharkey. With less than a week to go until the federal election, time is running out for the leaders to push their messages and sway voters. As the final days in the campaign tick away, we're seeing the leaders sharpening their attacks and becoming more personal in criticizing their opponents. For a closer look at this final week, we're joined by CBC's National Affairs editor, Chris Hall. He's also host of The House on CBC Radio 1. Chris, good morning.
Hey, Julianne, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for talking to us. So we have less than a week to go until Election Day. How are the main parties polling right now?
It's a really tight race at the top between the Liberals and Conservatives, really no space between them, making it hard to predict how the election will unfold. The NDP also doing well compared to what they polled in 2019, which, as we head to British Columbia, which is a critical battleground, three-way races, including the NDP, will make it an interesting and probably very late night on Monday. Mm-hmm. Two wildcards, though, Julianne, that I need to point out. The first is the polls are showing some movement in Quebec after the English language debate, where anger over questions about Quebec's secularism law and whether it discriminates against religious minorities prompted a strong backlash from Premier François Legault and the Quebec media. This morning, Leger reporting the Bloc is up 3 points there to 30%, just behind the Liberals, so that's one thing to watch for. And the other is support for the People's Party of Canada in some parts of the country, including potentially southwestern Ontario. He may not have, Maxime Bernier, the leader, may not have enough support to really win seats, but if they start taking away significant numbers of votes in some ridings from the Conservatives, it may allow one of the other parties to come up the middle and win a seat that the Conservative would normally have taken.
Yes, you're talking about vote splitting there. I wonder who has the most to lose when it comes to that.
Well, it depends on where you are. In Ontario, in your listenership area, clearly the Liberals would benefit from an alternative to Erin O'Toole on the right of the political spectrum, and certainly we all think that the Progressive or the People's Party of Canada is going to take votes away from the Conservatives. But there's also like the Green vote. We're not sure what's happening with that, and some ridings are not running candidates, and the Liberals also in some parts of the province have lost Canada, Kitchener in particular. So it is going to be very hard to know how this will all unfold with 6 days left.
And in these final days, what are the messages that the leaders are really trying to hammer out, that they're trying to get across right now?
For the Conservatives, I think it's a change message that it's time now to look at the Conservatives as an alternative to the Liberals. They basically understand that if they're going to win, they have to make it a referendum on Justin Trudeau's leadership. The Liberals, it's basically a promise to stay with us, a commitment that we will follow up on what we've said we will do, which has been a bit of an issue. The NDP, Jagmeet Singh in particular, saying the Liberals are great at talking but not so great at doing. So look for a barrage of ads, probably negative about why their opponents aren't worth a vote, both on the traditional media but also on social media too, where the Liberals have been spending far more than their opponents so far.
Yesterday, O'Toole was taking aim at Trudeau, and it seems like the tone is becoming more personal, or the attacks are becoming more personal. What does that mean?
Well, for Erin O'Toole, I think it suggests that he understands that this is a really close race, and he has to abandon the talk about policy and being positive, which he promised at the beginning, and to try to undermine Justin Trudeau. And he really went after character, which is unusual, but maybe not now in the backdrop of anti-vaccination protests and the like, but after Justin Trudeau's character, look at some of the words he called him. He said that Justin Trudeau was entitled, privileged, only concerned with looking out for himself. He said he wasn't an environmentalist, not a feminist, a man who's focused solely and squarely on his own political fortunes. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh also has portrayed Trudeau as someone who will say that he'll do things but not follow through, whether it's on climate change or improving the lives of Indigenous people. And Trudeau, he had to respond, obviously, and he did yesterday. He accused Erin O'Toole of pandering to anti-vaxxers, to the gun lobby, people opposed to a woman's right to choose, all in an effort, I think, to try and portray Andrew portray Aaron O'Toole as a kinder, gentler, but still right-wing ideologue, similar to Andrew Scheer and Stephen Harper, the two previous Conservative leaders he defeated at the polls.
When I see election campaigning become more negative or take on more of a personal aim, I wonder if it could backfire, if voters leave feeling more cynical, more disenfranchised.
Yeah, Justin Trudeau was asked that both in his town hall yesterday on CBC television, but also in campaign stops. The whole idea being here that you're supposed to be presenting people with a positive choice. You want them to look to the future, and by basically attacking the bona fides of your opponent and saying that he's in the thrall of people who are against gun control, for example, only serves to further divide the population. O'Toole was asked many of the same questions. So you're right. It's not the style of politicking that Canadians are generally used to. They don't tend to like it. But unfortunately, as the numbers would show over the past several elections, negative ads often work. So I expect you'll hear more of it.
Chris, what will you be watching for as we count down to Election Day?
Well, a couple of things. Just how nasty this campaign will get, particularly among the leaders. Questions about a minority government. If the polls are right, there really is no party that has an opportunity to form a majority here at Julianne. So is Jagmeet Singh, for example, the NDP leader in third place in the polls, is he willing to work with the Conservatives? He's been asked that a number of times and has not yet given a clear answer. And one other factor, the number of COVID-19 cases in schools is beginning to rise in different parts of the country, especially among students who aren't old enough yet to be vaccinated. The Liberals, I know, were concerned about a September 20th polling date because kids would have been back in school for 2 weeks. And, with cases in 3 Toronto schools, we've heard about problems in Moncton and in Yellowknife where schools are being temporarily closed on Prince Edward Island. It may be an important factor for those parents who have not yet voted and will be waiting for Monday to see whether or not they are moved by the idea that this was not necessarily an election campaign that had to be held at this time, and to sort of have that maybe infiltrate their thinking as they begin to look at whose box they want to check.
Chris, it's always great talking to you. Thank you very much for your insight this morning.
All right. Thanks, Julianne.
Chris Hall is National Affairs Editor with CBC's Parliamentary Bureau and host of The House on CBC Radio 1. Well, social media reports indicate that wait times were long at several Barrie advance polling stations, with one woman posting that she waited 45 minutes at Holy Rex Centre. What caused the delays, and what can we expect to see on Election Day? Réjean Grenier is Regional Media Advisor with Elections Canada for Ontario. Réjean, good morning.
Good morning, Julianne.
What kind of wait times did we see at Barrie polls for advance polling?
Well, it depends on the poll, obviously. Some areas were rolling around quite well. Others had, indeed, wait times, and 45 minutes has been in the realm of things. And there's 2 reasons for that. The very first one is because of a short election and because of the pandemic, it was harder for us to recruit poll workers. Therefore, we may, in some polling stations, have less poll workers to deal with throngs of people who want to vote. And that will be the same on Election Day for sure. I mean, although we are seeing an uptick in people applying to work on that day because it's quite a good gig, actually. It pays well, and it's one day, and then boom, you're home, So that's a good sign. The other reason why that would happen is also because of COVID. For example, now at each polling station, we have a person that will be taking some contact information from people, their name and a phone number or whatever to reach them. In case some COVID would happen at that place, health authorities would want to know who was there in order to do some contact tracing. So that's just another step in the process that slows down a little bit.
Right, the slowing things down. And what we're seeing in Barrie, are we seeing these delays really across the province?
It depends where, obviously. In smaller communities, hey, things have been rolling right along. But in larger communities where you have more people, that is obvious. Now, also remember that on advanced polls, we have a lot less polls than we will on Election Day.
Mm-hmm.
Mind you, on Election Day, we'll also have more people voting. So, I would say to people, hey, just do what you've been doing for 18 months, waiting in line at stores. You're going to do the same at Elections Canada. We're not above that.
Yes, which is good news if you're saying that there's more workers will be on Election Day. But I wonder, in terms of what we have seen so far, do you have any sense, or do you think that this has impeded anyone's ability to exercise their right to vote or deterred them in any way?
Nothing is impeding people except maybe their impatience.
Mm-hmm. In terms of going forward to Election Day, how much interest have you seen in applications for working at polling stations?
We've seen some interest in the last week or so. We have done more advertising about it, for sure, and that has stimulated some interest in some people, and we've seen an uptick. Now, it's unequal. I mean, it depends on the area, it depends on the city, but hopefully we will have more people on election. Well, we know we will have more people on Election Day. Obviously, we have more polls. Mm-hmm. But do we have enough? We never have enough.
Okay. So still looking to generate more interest there.
Absolutely. If people are interested, it's a good gig. You can work there it's a long day. It's 12 hours, but you walk out of there, you may have made between $200 to $400 in one day.
What else can people expect to see on Election Day on September 20th?
Well, I hope they won't see rain, for one thing. Mm-hmm. The other thing is people have to remember to bring their proper identification, which means some government document that would have both their name and their address on it. For example, a driver's license would be perfect. If they don't have that, they can bring something that has their photo and name, like, for example, in Ontario, the health card, but then they need to but that doesn't have an address, so they need to bring something with an address. For example, an electrical bill would work, and that would be nice. They don't need to bring their voter information card, but it's very important that they look at it so that they know where their polling station is, because a lot of polling stations this year are in different places than from mm-hmm. previous years. For example, a lot of school boards did not allow Elections Canada to put polling stations in their schools, which means we had to look far and wide to find places. So people should look at their voter information card. They can also bring it to the polling station. It's not an ID document, but it does expedite the process, because the poll workers can just look at it and say, okay, you're at that poll, boom, go there and vote, you know?
And this is the last day to register for mail-in ballot, correct?
That's right. People have to remember also that they are going, unless they have a medical exemption, they are going to have to wear a mask to vote. And if you don't want to do that, or for any other reason you don't want to go to a polling station, today is the last day until 6 o'clock to apply for a mail-in ballot. And we're getting close on time, and we're relying on Canada Post to send it to you and to send it back. So do it quickly.
Réjean, great talking to you. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Julianne.
Réjean Grenier is Regional Media Advisor with Elections Canada for Ontario. Berries and stone fruit may have their heyday in the summer, but the fall is all about the mighty apple. What kind of season has it been for apple farmers, and what can you expect if you go apple picking? Kathy McKay is an apple grower from Port Perry and the chairperson for Ontario Apple Growers. Kathy, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning.
What have conditions been like for growing apples this season?
Overall, I'd say we had a good season. We've had a few hiccups, which is quite normal when you're growing tree fruit. And we are, subject to whatever the weather throws at us. Sure. So in the spring, we had a little bit of frost here and there, but not a lot. So that brought the crop down a little bit, because it destroys the blossoms. And then we had lots of rain in July, which was good, and then lots of sun in August to make great sugars in the fruit. And then recently we had some hail, but I would say usually, there's this percentage of acreage hailed every year in the province, and this is not unusual this year. So the crop's down about 10 to 15% over our average, but the individual fruits have very good size and quality.
Okay, so even with the hiccups, the crop is looking strong this year.
It is.
What has been your experience on the farm?
Well, we were very, very dry for March, April, May, and June. Luckily, we got caught up in July with moisture, and our crop is probably similar. It's down about 15%, but the fruit is larger than normal, and less competition on the tree. And so very good quality. Are there any varieties of apple that are down in particular that 10 to 15% really affects? Yes. So our champion, Honeycrisp, is down the most this year. It's a finicky apple, difficult to grow. It likes to rest every other year. And so it's decided that it's resting this year. So it's, I would say, down 25% or more. Okay. The temperamental Honeycrisp, which also happens to be my favorite. Yeah, that's right. And it is it's just how it is. I call it the prima donna of the orchard. I'm going to remember that, the prima donna of the orchard. Another thing I know in the last year and a half during the pandemic that apple growers have really contended with is a shortage of workers. So is that a big issue on apple farms right now? It has been. In the summer, it was workers were late getting here, particularly from the West Indies, where flights were delayed and that sort of thing. I would say for harvest, because the crop is down somewhat, I think we're in pretty good shape. When people go picking apples, I'm seeing pictures already of people going to different orchards around Ontario. What are your words of advice for them? What should they be looking for when they're choosing apples? Well, first of all, I would, all the pick your own places have websites, and most of them talk about what is at its peak. So the varieties all have their special time, and I would, if I was going to a farm, I would pick a variety that's at its absolute peak for flavor and freshness, and choose that apple. And also look for good size, color, and make sure that there's no blemishes. And which varieties might those be that are at their peak? So right now, Gala and McIntosh, Silken are three that are at their peak. And then in the next week or two, a whole bunch of apples come on stream, including Honeycrisp and Empire and Spartan, and yeah. Do you have a favorite, or is it like choosing a child? It's hard to choose. So I'm one of those people that just as they reach their peak and are at the best flavor, I just go from one variety to the next eating. Yeah, get to have all the different wonderful tastes that apples bring. Kathy, it's been great talking to you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Kathy McKay is an apple grower from Port Perry and the chairperson for Ontario Apple Growers.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.